Our first guest, Dr. Jennifer Matos. Jen's doctorate degree was completed at UMass Amherst, and she specializes in social justice in education, and she's interested in the role of equality and liberation in learning communities. And as most of our audience are currently in learning communities, it seems really fitting that she sort of sets off our evening for us. She currently teaches at Mount Holyoke College in the Psychology and Education Department, as well as in the graduate education programs. And more importantly, it was her birthday yesterday. So happy birthday, Jen.
Happy birthday.
Jen, if you could now come on and unmute your microphone and let us see your video, then Lauren will work with you as you work through your slides. Once Jen has finished, we will introduce our next guest, and then we'll have a Q&A session.
Hi, Jen. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Jen. So we're going to take Lily and I off, and we'll just leave you with your slides. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Thanks, Jen. Happy birthday.
Hey, thank you so much. So everything was pretty much in the introduction. I'm teaching at Mount Holyoke College in the Psychology and Education Department, and I have a doctorate in education from UMass Amherst with the specialization in social justice education. And my main research interest, it has to do with Latino parents and how they value education. And I want to tell you a little bit about how that became my focus for my research. And it happened a long, long time ago. I identify as Puerto Rican. I was raised by a single parent. My mom raised 3 of us by herself, and worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs to put us through school, to get us, get our tuition paid, pay for our books, our uniforms, all of that. And she worked night shift, mostly in the hospital. And when she would come in the morning to get us ready for school, I would come down to breakfast, and the page would be open of my workbook where I didn't finish my math problems. And so she would come home from work, and as tired as she was, she still managed to get some energy, enough energy to go through my things and my sister's things to check our homework. She was very strict about school. She loved education. She thought that education was the key to success. And she taught us to be respectful in our classrooms. She taught us that when we were at school, the teacher was the boss, and when we were home, she was the boss, but that we were to respect the teacher and listen to her, and treated teachers as if they were people who were doing us a favor by teaching us. So even though they were getting paid, it was this, they're doing us a favor by sharing their time and educating us. So she pushed education on us. I remember Mom telling me when I was about 6, she said, "You're going to school until you have gray hair." And I said, "I'm going to be so old." And she said she didn't care, I was going to do it. And so I loved school. I was a good student in school, and there wasn't a choice. There wasn't a choice whether or not I was going to excel at school. It was, you're going to school, you're going to college. I don't know how we're going to pay. I don't know how you're going to pay for it, she told me, but you're going. So I went to college. I was first generation college student. I was the first, and I stumbled upon, I went to Smith for my undergrad. I didn't know what it was. It was a total accident that I ended up there. But not bad for a first shot at college. I went back to Smith and got a master's of arts in teaching. I was the first person in my family to get a master's degree. And then I went to UMass Amherst and got a doctorate, and I was the first person to get a doctorate and the first person in my family to be a faculty member. So there are all these firsts. There are all these first generation moments for me. And so during my doctoral studies, I started reading about, I knew I wanted to do research on Latino parents because that was something that interested me. But during my doctoral studies, I noticed that there was a lot of literature around Latino parents who were uninvested. There was a lot of literature on Latinos and deficits in education. And then I did a pilot study with women from Smith College, and they were saying things that were similar to my experience. So they had single parent Latino moms who were also truly invested in education, very strict about it, had similar rules to the rules my mom had. Some things were different, but for the most part, they were the same. So then I started to wonder, how can it be that we have these 2 stories? How can it be that we have literature that says Latino parents aren't involved and invested in education, And how can we have these other experiences of women saying, but wait a second, my mother wasn't like that. My mother was a proponent for education. So why the two stories? And so then that's kind of how my research kind of got its fiery start. And so guiding my work was an article by Tara Yosso called Whose Culture Has Capital? And that was my analytical framework for my research. And so for my dissertation research, I wanted to look at how these forms of capital described, and I'll go through these, described by Yosso, were transmitted from Latino parents to Latino students. And forgive me for saying Latino, I know it's the male version. I'm trying to use Latinx. It's a little tricky. It's still kind of new to me. So she talks about these 6 different forms of cultural capital. And I wanted to see if these, as she describes it, if these forms of cultural capital are transmitted from parent to student. And if they are, what do college students do with these forms of capital once they get to college? And I was looking at first-generation college students. So aspirational capital is kind of that si se puede capital. Like, yes, you can do anything. I know personally, I could have told my mother I was going to be an astronaut and she would have said, go for it. She would have had no issue. She would have supported me through it. Familial capital is family capital. But in Latino circles and families aren't restricted to blood relatives. So Latinos will adopt people, will adopt cousins, will adopt surrogate sisters, aunts and uncles, we'll have all these people, community members, coaches, pastors, so all different kinds of people make up our families. Linguistic capital, it's more than being bilingual, it's attention to detail, dramatic pauses, use of comedy, use of inflection, navigational capital, the ways in which we can work through systems and work through bureaucracy. So how do we find the things we need? Resistant capital. Resistant capital is something I want to look at a little more, which is an inherent sense of what's right and wrong, of what's just and how to work for justice. And I think that sometimes our Latino students are getting read as troublemakers. When they speak up against teachers. I know when I was teaching in the public school system, Latino students would be among the first to tell me, this isn't fair, this isn't right, why is this happening? And I'd have to answer to them. And so I think students are getting read as troublemakers, but they're not. I think their resistant capital is showing up. And then social capital. How do we use our networks, our personal networks, to get what we need? And so I was looking to see if, first of all, if all 6 forms of capital were present. And I worked with students from 3 different types of institutions. An all-women's college, a flagship university, a state school, and a community college. And so looking at the different forms of capital, I found that they were present in the study. So not that all 6 were present at the women's college or all 6 were present at the state school, but all 6 were manifested within the study. And more than that, I found that there were other types of things happening as a result. So first, that one of the things Latino students were doing is they were replicating family structures. So they were taking what they had learned about familial capital and duplicating it all over the place. So there was a male student who said, yeah, my roommate's not my roommate, he's my brother. And it wasn't his brother, he had adopted him like a brother. There was someone at the community college, many people at the community college who didn't have a maternal figure, and they had adopted a woman who had worked there, a staff member, and she was the person they would go to her office. She would know their schedules. She would say, I know you have a class right now, get out of my office and go to class. So that she acted as a surrogate mom. There were students who, if their families had dinner together on Sunday nights, they would make sure they all had dinner together on Sunday nights. They would tease each other like siblings. So everything they learned in their families, they would do over. And then there was this other interesting thing that kept popping up in the research when I was doing my analysis. And that was that when I talked to students about graduating, none of the participants used the word graduate. Nobody said when I graduate, they all said when I finish. And when I went back into the data, I thought it was odd that, we talk about graduation. I think as faculty, we talk about graduation. And these students were, no, when I finish, I have to finish. And there's this big push on finishing. So I go back and ask participants again some follow-up questions. And I had a hunch of what the answer would be, but it was really poignant to hear from the participants what was going on for them. And that was that they had noted the sacrifices that their families had made for them to get an education. There was one woman whose family had drugged her to fit her in the area of the car where you put a spare tire to get over the border. And her parents wanted her to get an education, and that's why they did that. There were other family members who gave up everything, their really great jobs and high-paying positions in other countries so they can come to the United States and so their children could get an education. And so those stories were with these participants, and they talked about wanting to close that loop, that their families had started them on this journey, and they were going to complete that. They were going to close that loop. So I thought that was really interesting to see how they were paying tribute to their families and how they didn't forget. When we tell people don't forget where you came from, they weren't forgetting where they came from and how their educational journeys began. This research topic is something I have a lot of energy for. And so there are different things that I want to look at in the future directions for this research. One is looking at cultural capital in other racial groups. So I don't believe that this is unique to Latino communities. I believe that communities of color have cultural capital when it comes to education, and I'd like to investigate how that shows up. There are other forms of capital yet to be explored with this, spiritual and aesthetic capital. I'd like to see cultural capital transmission from students to their parents and caregivers. So even though sometimes the Latino parents will have limited education, limited formal education. And so they have an idea of what the formal school system looks like, but it's the students who are in the system. And so students share that vocabulary with their parents. I know this happens a lot with the college students as well. And then Latino parental resilience. So it's not easy to be a Latino student in US public schools. So I don't anticipate or expect that it's easy for Latino parents to be in this system. And yet they keep showing up and they keep having their children, they keep voicing their value for education. So why is that? So I'm currently working with 2 Francis Perkins scholars who have been going into the Holyoke school system and interviewing Latino parents. We're going to be having a focus group this week, and to talk about why do they keep showing up? If they keep getting knocked down, why do they keep showing up? So those are a couple different directions that I would like to take this research.